Hello, creative friends. Welcome. This is for our Mindful Art Q&A Tuesday call. And I want to start by saying that whether you're joining us live or on the replay, if you consider yourself creative or you don't, and you're just curious about your creativity, or if you're an artist or a therapist or a teacher, we're going to be diving in today and chatting about mindfulness, creativity, teaching mindful art if you're curious. And before we dive in, so you're welcome to put in the chat any questions that you have. And hello, Joanne, Sharon, and Sean. So as you're putting questions in the chat, I want to share a very brief story about our first live that was scheduled this morning, because I think it ties in so beautifully with the creative muse and with creativity. So for some of you that tried to join this morning, it ended up being more of a silent film because we had some sound issues. So it looks like you can hear me fine now, which is beautiful. And I was just thinking about that since this morning of how often I, and perhaps you, if you can relate to this, let me know in the chat, how often I've wanted to do something creatively and I've had a fear that's blocked me from doing that thing because I've been worried it might not work out or I might be missing something. And then the power in starting anyways, and also how we can be imperfectly perfect. So I thought about a quote from Brene Brown earlier, which is that imperfection is not about inadequacies. Imperfection points to the fact that we're all in this together. And so, what that means for me is that we're all human. We all sometimes have technical glitches. But we also, I think, have this relationship to wanting to create something, wanting to do something, sometimes self sabotaging, feeling stuck, or something happens and then we retreat. And so, my invitation, my hope for a reminder for myself, but also for you as you're here with me live or on the replay, is being curious about for yourself what might be that thing that I've been really curious to try, that I've been wanting to do creatively, that I've been wanting to step into with my teaching, but I've been holding myself back or I've been feeling blocked. And that's something that you can always journal about. Maybe just take 2 minutes after this call is done and really feel into that and just imagine what would that next small step be that you can take towards it. So I just wanted to mention that. Hi, Pia and Birna. So good to see some of you here. And on the replay also, if you're joining, you can put in the chat and say hello. So I have a couple of questions already. And then if you have more questions, please put them in the chat as well. I'm going to dive into a couple of the questions I have here. And what I find, so I do Q&A calls with our teacher trainees for some of our Mindful Art teacher trainings. We dive in with more coaching support, but usually what ends up happening is as one person asks a question and we start talking about things, it tends to spark more curiosities and questions overall. And so as we talk about questions, if anything comes up for you, experiences, things that you've learned along the way, or other questions, please definitely put them in the chat. So good to see you, Pia. Welcome back. So this first question, and I'll say this also, some of the questions I have are around creativity, whether it's digital or traditional, mindful art for beginners versus if you have been doing the practice for a while and you feel more comfortable with either meditation or mindfulness or art making. I have some questions that are specifically around navigating self-judgment as we're starting to create, which I think is so perfect for today, as well as choosing themes. So that might be themes in your art practice, like I want to create something, but where do I even begin? Or I would love to go down this path and how to kind of narrow down in that focus, or if you're teaching as well. So how can you theme some of your offerings for teaching? So that's what I have kind of already on my list of things, and I'm sure there'll be more questions. But I want to share and begin with this first question that comes from Jana. And she says, what are your thoughts on sometimes using an iPad for the practice? So for any sort of creative drawing practice, it might be mindful art. It could just be drawing in general. She says, I have ADHD, and sometimes the quickest way for me to start or even do journaling or a musings practice is to get my iPad and just begin. I tend to give up or procrastinate on the thing if I encounter even just a bit of resistance or a hurdle. And she says, if the weather's too cold and I just want to stay under the blanket, relatable. If I can't find the right pen, or if I forgot to put water, etc. And this is on the top of things I think about while doing the practice. So she says, I do enjoy using pens, watercolors, and the path of least resistance for me is using the iPad. And she said, I would love some thoughts and insights from you guys. And I love that she said from the group, not just from me. So if you have anything that you want to share in the chat also, please chime in. I love this question because I think what really speaks to me is this idea of resistance. What gets in our way from beginning? And a lot of times the resistance I've found is what stops me from even starting. And I've heard this so much from people that have joined in my classes and trainings. And so I love how she mentions she knows already, or Jana, if you're watching this replay, you know already that the path to least resistance for you is through your iPad. So I say go for that. Like if you already know the path that has some tread and wear on it, where if you think about like a record player and you can drop into that groove a little bit easier, follow that path, absolutely. And then you might find as you're creating or you're in that flow that it feels a bit easier to then also pick up your pen or watercolors or step outside of your comfort zone. So I love that as a way to step in. Something that I often say as well, and that I've practiced for so many years for myself, is how can I remove barriers from me beginning? And so some of you have probably heard me say this if you're on my email list, that I talk about having a 5-minute like timer, just setting 2 or 5 minutes, and not so you only create for that amount of time, and maybe that's all you have. But largely, I find it's because once we begin and start, then it's much easier to keep going. The other thing, as a way to help move through any sort of resistance or hurdles, is you can have really simple supplies. I don't have it here next to me, but I have like a little goodie bag of some of my favorite things that I'm playing with at that time that I can take with me. And that's something you can have with you when you're at, a doctor's office or you're on your break. I have this just right here next to me on my table. And so these are a couple of my favorite things that I use, micron pens, some of my watercolor brushes. So that's what I would say. And I would love to hear in the chat as well, if you're doing the live or the replay, what do you know for yourself feels like an easy way for you to begin? And if nothing comes to mind for you, like the type of media, or your favorite pen or journal you want to work with, then that's something that I would encourage that you can start exploring a variety of practices where you're guided. I have a 30 days of 5-minute mindful art activities playlist on my channel that you could always watch and just kind of watch a couple of different ones and see what might speak to you. So that can be a good way to get started as well. But I love that question. And hi, I see Hillary and Sophia also. And I think I have a question also from Sophia. So I'm going to hop into the next question just so we have time to explore a lot of different ones. This next question is talking about body scan drawings. So I want to show an example of what I mean by that for anyone who, if you're not already familiar. I've talked about it here on the channel. But this is a body scan drawing meditation. I refer to it as like a gingerbread person, the outline, because I used to make gingerbread cookies with my mom when I was younger. So it doesn't have to be in this outline or shape. Sometimes I do this in a circle. Sometimes I do it in a triangle. The main part about this practice is that we're doing a body scan from top to bottom or toes up to our head. And we're just noticing for ourselves what are sensations that we're feeling, such as warmth or coolness or tingling. We're noticing any sort of judgments or thoughts that are coming in, or perhaps emotions. And if you feel comfortable, as you notice sensations, you can also be curious about, oh, I feel tightness in my shoulders. What color might that be like? And maybe that's a red, knotted, swirly color. So that's a little bit about the body scan drawing meditation. It's basically a really simple, fun, mindful art activity that can help you to just notice what you notice right now. And many of you already know this because you're here and you know me, but for anyone watching the replay, if you're not familiar with mindful art practices as well, it's really just marrying mindfulness and coming back to the present moment without judgment with really simple art practices. as a way that I find that we can a lot of times create more freely or with less internal judgment. And also, it can be a way that we can practice a form of meditation. And many of you, if you get into like a flow state as you're creating, you might have experienced that feeling. But so I'll come back to the question. I just wanted to name what that is, the body scan drawing. So let's see. So she says, I really enjoy this method as my visual mind can understand more of how I feel while drawing it on the paper. My question is this method good for a beginner in the group or for more advanced? So this is coming from someone who's in one of my teacher trainings. So I'll answer it for both your own practice as well as if you're a teacher. And she says, I was just wondering if I would know what to do if that was my first time. And she has a picture of her body scan drawing that she included. So, what I love about the body scan drawing practice, and I have another video that will walk you through that on my channel if you're curious to be guided through one, is that it can be wherever you are in your journey, whether you've never drawn, you've never meditated, you've been doing the practice for many years, or you also have been teaching now or facilitating for many years. It is different every time you come to the practice, which I love. And it's really simple. So you can always begin. So so it's really for all of the above. She asks, is it for beginners or more advanced? What I would say for anyone who is teaching as you're sharing is, and I can say much more on that in my coaching calls and in the training, but when you are sharing with someone or even just noticing for yourself in your own practice, is you can pause and you can check in and see, how is this feeling? Am I wanting to use different materials right now? As you're sharing with groups, and I name this for your own practice too, we tend to all have our own experience. So for some of you, it might be really easy to notice sensations in your body. So, like right now, I can feel my toes are cold. I can feel a little bit of tingling in my low back area. I can feel some tightness in my shoulders. So that's very easy for me to notice the sensations in my body, and that might change from day to day. For some people, it might be really easy to imagine colors or shapes as we're feeling and sensing into our body. And for others, that might be more challenging. We can feel the sensations in our body, but we may or may not know. Well, I'm not really sure what kind of color that would represent or what type of like mark or pattern to make with it. And so I always like to name that just to honor where we are, honor our own experience. A big part about the mindful art practices, which I love, which is why I do this work, is that there's so much permission. So, permission for you to have your own experience, that there's no right or wrong way that you would be making any of the body scan drawings. But there's also no right or wrong way that you feel into the practice for yourself. The the kind of the part that I really love is that it's really about having, I think of like a bowl or a container, and this bowl or container can hold us as we're creating. And, or sometimes I think about it like a soft pink blanket. That's just what I visualize of how can I have just curiosity in this moment and kindness towards myself. And I don't know about any of you. I'd be curious to hear actually in the chat how many of you have an experience related to your creativity, maybe when you were younger, around being told, like, no, you're not doing that right with creativity. And as I wait to see if any of you share a response with that, Brene Brown also talks about this in her research, that when she researched adults, it was like 80% of adults that she found had some sort of shame story connected to creativity when they were younger, like under 6 or 8 years old. And I can remember when I was younger, I came late into an art class and they said to draw a heart. And so I started drawing a heart. And I remember the teacher said to me, they like came over and scolded me and said, no, you're supposed to be drawing an anatomical heart. And I had missed those instructions because I was late to the class. And so it's so fascinating to me how much I remember that moment, a very small, minuscule moment. And what I heard, as a little kiddo, is that what I'm doing, what I'm creating with my art isn't right. And that's something I know and I can name and I can see now. and I give myself lots of permission to create and lots of other people to create. But usually, when I'm doing live workshops and I ask this question, almost everybody has some sort of memory or story connected to our creativity where there's been some sort of external judgment that maybe now we've internalized. So I love with mindful art activities that there's so much permission that we can be kind to ourselves, that we can be curious in the moment. It might be through a body scan drawing, it might be through, there's so many different practices that I teach and that others teach. So there's so many different paths that we can explore it. But I want to pause. I saw lots of things happening in the chat. So I want to peek over that. Sharon says that she usually gets inspiration from the book that she's reading, and some words really stand out in her mind. Absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit about books also later. I don't like searching ideas on social media. Fair. Everybody's different. It takes more time and often limits your creativity. Yeah, so that's super nice to have something tangible that you can have in your hands, like a book and with words. So I see some people mentioning art teachers and parents have done that you've had a similar experience. And I love Pia's recommendation, or what she mentions is just making the first mark on the page with a pen and then having things flow from there. So I sometimes have heard that referred to as like an anchor mark or a root mark, that you have that initial gesture. And I share that a lot in my, I have a, let's see if I have an example. I share that with a squiggle squares practice where I usually invite six different, it depends on the size of your page, but six different blocks. And each of these blocks began with a very quick gesture or mark, like a squiggle on the page. And then once you have that, you can start to be curious about what other lines do you want to darken or embellish or go back in. A lot of times I'll add color. That was just a quick like gestural exercise. But what I love about that Pia is bringing up is that sometimes the whole blank page syndrome or blank canvas syndrome can be overwhelming. And that's also a barrier that can keep us from starting. And so having some sort of mark on the page very quickly where you're not even thinking about it can help move past that blank page or blank canvas syndrome. But also I find it's like planting a seed, and then we can start to be curious about that particular mark or shape or color. And because we're doing it in such a kind of quick, intuitive way, sometimes even doing it with your non-dominant hand can be really fun. Because we're doing that, we might be making marks that we wouldn't normally make if we, were really sitting and thinking about it. And so it can be a fun jumping off point, and can be a way to begin. So I love that you mentioned that. Thank you so much. And then I'm seeing from Caroline, being told not doing it right at school, mostly in private drawing, painting lessons, and piano. Yeah. So I did my master's in the arts, and in many ways, it was such a beautiful experience. And also in other ways, it kind of taught me how I didn't want my art to be, and how I wanted to have more spaciousness for curiosity and play and experimentation. And so, yeah, so I love those chats. Thank you so much for sharing. And this next question is kind of related, and actually it's from Sophia, that was previous in our in one of our online portals. So it says, do you have the human gingerbread figure pre-made before starting the guided meditation? I'm thinking if that, for people who usually feel hugely self-judgmental, if the attempt to outline can be a bit frustrating, if the image doesn't exactly end up how they like it or idealize it. And she's asking for teachers as well, do we suggest people to draw the outline beforehand, as in the creative demo part? And that's, I have an 8-step facilitator framework that I teach. So she's referring to one of those steps. And she said, do we have an outline pre-made to give to people who struggle with self-judgment? Do we integrate the outline drawing as part of the practice? So all super great questions. There's so many different ways you can approach it. Sometimes what I like to do, and this is whether I'm sharing just for your specific practice or as a teacher, if you're considering this, sometimes I'll very often show an example of, this is kind of the gingerbread outline, this is the circle and the square, and I'll talk about what some of the benefits are to drawing within that different shape. And then I often will invite then for people to explore whichever one calls to them the most. Or if you're confused or you're not sure and you're like, I don't even know which one I want to try or draw in, um, that you can begin with the gingerbread person. And if it's something where I'm working in person with people, I have had different types of worksheets printed out with different forms and shapes so people can choose. And then also sometimes I'll just guide and draw with them. So if you're doing it online as a teacher or just for yourself, like watching one of my videos or doing a class, then usually that's something you would just draw for yourself. I think for me, part of the practice of even drawing the gingerbread outline or circles on the page or squares on the page is for me, that's also part of the mindful art practice to notice, am I noticing that I'm being judgmental about the shape that I'm making right now? And how can I notice that, name it as a thought, and come back to the page in a kind way? So I mention a lot of times with mindful art practices that we're using the art as an anchor point. So, the same way when people explore breath meditations and the focus is on the breath. So, if you get distracted, you have a inner critical thought or a judgment, or you're thinking about your grocery list, that you have that thought and then you just notice it and you come back to your breath. So, we're doing a lot of the same things with our art making for lots of reasons. Part of that is to just help us return back again and again. So we are creating. Another thing that does, I feel like, is that, with yoga, they always say like the way you practice on the mat is how you practice off the mat. So the more we can be kind to ourselves in our art journal or on a canvas as we're creating, the more we can give ourselves permission to play and be curious and not worry about doing it right or wrong. I find that that can translate out in the world as well. And I hear this from so many people that I work with. Is that then you'll notice when you're out in the world, when things come up, there can be this softness of noticing inner critical thoughts that you might have and coming back to your breath or to that one next step with kindness. So, but there's so many different ways you can approach that. So I want to check back in the chat again. And I'm noticing Chrissy mentioning from kind of the last question we were talking about, another starting point she likes to use is to splatter color or many colors on the page. Absolutely. And then noticing Virna is mentioning nature is an inspiration, going for a walk. Absolutely. I love that. So I'd love to jump. If you have any other questions too, you can put them in the chat now live or even in the replay, because if you put them in there in the replay, I can always have them for our next call as well. So I want to jump into this next question because it's a little bit related to nature and some of the other prompts or ways of beginning that some of you have talked about. And this next question comes from Liz, and she says, I've just started the module in the Muse journaling teacher training. That's one of the 4 that I teach that explores themes and planning your mindful art offerings. I'm curious about themes and art, the importance of themes, and if you can share more about how to choose themes or plan your offerings. And so I'll speak about it for both teaching as well as for your own personal practice. So themes, I often like to think about themes with art. A lot of times it's referred to as like a series or a motif with what you're creating. That the more let's say you're creating something with a Sharpie and doing it in a circle, so more of a mandala shape, the more you create in that circle with that Sharpie over time and having some variations, the more and more you can start to see a particular thread through some of your art that you're making and through your process as well. Like it can be really fascinating and curious to just notice, I'm working in a circle again with the same one pen, but this is how it's changing over time, and this is what I'm noticing as the same. And also kind of following the breadcrumbs of what am I curious about from each one can be so fun. So that's kind of what we're referring to as the themes. And I see Sharon clapping, saying she does the same thing as Verna. I love that. And so with themes, one thing I'd like to recommend is that you can look outside for inspiration and then also turn inward. So what I mean by that is there was the mention of nature earlier in the chat that Caroline, or yeah, I think it was Caroline. I would have to go back through the chat of who said she gets inspired with nature. So I would make a like heartstorm a list if you want to jot this down, or you can just do this in your own head as well. Is just thinking to yourself, what are particular media that I'm curious about? And you may have already played with these, or maybe you never have, but you've always just been curious. So, what are certain art media that I'm curious about? It might be markers or colored pencils or watercolors. It could be oil pastels, collage, photography. So, maybe writing down like three different ones. What am I curious about with art media? What are particular types of shapes or marks or lines that I'm curious about? And that could be, it could be the type. So maybe you really like abstract art when you look at it. Maybe you really like geometrical shapes, or you really love like architecture and buildings. So right now we're just being curious, like what is it that I feel drawn to, and just getting that down on the page. You can also notice what are who are other artists that I feel really inspired by, and that those might be, artists with an A that you would find in museums. It might be artists that you see like when you walk into your building at work and you're noticing different things, or even on billboards, right? Like just noticing, are there certain colors that I feel really drawn to, or certain types of art? Sometimes for external inspiration too, it can be fun to look at like Pinterest boards. I have a lot of Pinterest boards that are already kind of gathered around line and certain patterns and shapes. And then the other thing is also not even looking at art in general, but just what inspires me, such as nature. Maybe you really enjoy leaves. Maybe you're really inspired by music. So we're just kind of noticing and naming that. And then what I also like to recommend or mention, especially for facilitators or educators, is to also consider what are quotes that you love. So you probably have heard me quote Brene Brown a lot, or Maya Angelou, who I love as well. So who are people whose words inspire me? And perhaps having, again, musical artists or quotes written down or listed. So this is just a way that you're kind of honoring your curiosities and having them all in one place. And then when you're exploring themes, whether it's for your personal work or your teaching, what you can do is it's kind of like a plug and play. Like I'm going to circle one of that I'm really curious about lines and this leaf pattern in nature and this poem from Maya Angelou in a circular shape. And so for the next week or 30 days, I'm only going to draw in a circle with this type of line while listening to this music, or you kind of get the gist of that. As you're if you're facilitating this, what I often like to recommend and mention is that themes are so important because it really can help guide the whole experience for the group that you're supporting. So if you imagine, or even if you were attending a workshop, if you were to imagine, let's say, a workshop that was all about um, grief, compared to if you were in a workshop that was all about play, those have very different foundational intentions and perhaps explorations that helps frame the work that you might be creating. So the theme is really just a way of like pointing your flashlight and saying, I'm going to focus on this particular area. And then I always like to say that I love collaborating with chance as I'm creating or as I'm teaching, that there's also this welcoming in of like, I don't know. And that's part of the beautiful part, is not knowing, but having enough of a foundation in the theme that again can just help you get started. Because I think one of the biggest barriers is feeling like I don't know where to begin, or I don't feel like I have time, or I've started and now I feel stuck. And so having some of these little tools in your tool belt can be a way that you can help support a more consistent, it doesn't have to be daily, but a more consistent practice for yourself, whether with your own creativity or with teaching, because it's over that time with your practice that there starts to be more of this like familiarity and comfortability. And I find also this more and more permission to express yourself, to follow those breadcrumbs. So I'm going to come back and just check over in the chat as well and see what other questions do you have that come up for you around perhaps mindful art or your own creative practice. What is it that you find that you struggle with, like when you want to create or when you want to be supporting other people and teaching other people? What is it that comes up for you? And I'll mention this one other, this isn't a most recent question, but this is a question I get often. So I want to mention it here as well to give you some time if you want to put anything in the chat live or on the replay. Is I get this question a lot of times around what's the difference between mindful art and art therapy? And I love that that question is asked. And I always make a point when I'm sharing online with exercises in social media or when I'm sharing workshops or teacher trainings to differentiate that. And it makes me think a little bit of the difference between if you went and had like met your best friend for coffee compared to if you're meeting with your therapist for support. Both of them might feel supportive. You might also tap into some things with you where you're like, oh, I wasn't really aware that was there. And it feels kind of tender. But the way the container is held is totally different. The intention is really different. And it's really similar to mindful art and art therapy. So, mindfulness and art activities together combined can be this way that we can notice what's coming up for ourselves in the moment, to be really kind to ourselves, to give ourselves permission to create and express. And that might also be thoughts and emotions that come up as we're noticing what's happening for us. It may not be, it might be that we're really, having fun exploring shapes and patterns. But so that's kind of the intention behind the mindful art practice. Whereas an art therapy practice, that intention really is to more deeply support something that perhaps you're struggling with. You're doing that with a professional, and they're guiding you through with different directives. So I just always like to name that, and also that I believe we're all creative, and so there's this we have this permission to explore our own creativity and follow those breadcrumbs. So I'm seeing in the chat, white page fear or blank page fear is your worst. Yeah, absolutely, definitely not alone in that struggle of feeling unsure how to begin or where to begin. So thank you so much for joining. What we're going to do is if you want to post any other questions in the chat, we're going to do this again next Tuesday with more questions. And then we might also theme some of the topics. But I'd love to have this time that we can dive deeper into our creative practice, specifically around mindfulness, as well as if you're a teacher, to offer support. But I'm so grateful for all of you that were here today. And I have some links in the description as well if you want to download a free workbook for prompts or just connect with me. But we will connect more soon. And in the meantime, I hope that you have a moment that you can tend to yourself and give yourself permission to express something creatively. So I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your day, and I will see you all soon. Okay, ciao. Thank you. Bye, Pia. Bye, everyone.